When my husband turned 30, he said he didn't want a normal birthday. No dinner reservations, no small gathering with friends, no predictable celebration. He wanted something that felt significant, something that would make the year feel different from the last. At first, I thought he was joking when he brought it up in bed. We were half watching a show neither of us cared about, both scrolling on our phones. He said it casually, like it was just another thought passing through his mind. A threesome, he said. I laughed automatically, waiting for him to laugh too. He didn't. He just looked at me, not challenging, not demanding, just curious about my reaction. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a joke. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel betrayed or disrespected. What I felt was curiosity, and that surprised me more than anything. We had been married for 5 years and together for almost 8. Our relationship wasn't broken, and we weren't bored with each other. If anything, we were comfortable in a way that felt stable and safe. Maybe that safety was exactly why the idea didn't scare me. We weren't trying to fix anything. There wasn't some hidden resentment pushing us toward this. It felt more like an experiment than a solution. We didn't decide overnight. We talked about it for weeks. We set boundaries carefully, like we were drafting a contract instead of planning something intimate. No emotional involvement. No secrecy. No repeating it unless we both fully agreed afterward. Those were the rules we wrote together. We approached it almost analytically. Profiles were made on a site designed for people looking for that kind of arrangement. We filtered through messages like we were hiring someone for a temporary position. It felt detached and strangely professional. That detachment made it easier to say yes to the idea. It made the fantasy feel contained. Then Angie appeared in our inbox. Her name hit me before her picture did. I recognized it from book club, from quiet conversations about novels and wine. We weren't close, but we were familiar. She messaged me first, not my husband. She said she'd always found me attractive and wondered if we were serious. That message made my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. When I told my husband who she was, he laughed in disbelief. He said it felt almost poetic that it would be someone I already knew. Someone who wasn't a stranger. We decided to meet her for coffee before anything else. It felt important to remove the anonymity. We wanted it to feel intentional, not reckless. The meeting was surprisingly normal. We talked about work, about books, about mutual acquaintances. If someone had walked by our table, they would have thought we were just 3 friends catching up. That normalcy was unsettling in its own way. The situation should have felt dramatic, but it didn't. It felt oddly grounded. Angie was confident, but not aggressive. She asked thoughtful questions about boundaries and expectations. It didn't feel like she was trying to insert herself into our marriage. On the drive home, my husband seemed excited. He kept saying how lucky we were that it had lined up so smoothly. I nodded, but something inside me felt unusually calm. The night finally came after weeks of anticipation. There was an electricity in the air that felt different from anything we'd experienced before. Not romantic exactly, but charged. I had spent too much time thinking about how I would feel watching them together. I had expected jealousy to rise up and choke me. Instead, I felt intensely aware of everything happening. There was awkwardness at first. Laughter that felt slightly forced. Then things began to flow naturally, like we were all adjusting to a new rhythm. I noticed my husband more than I noticed her. I watched his expressions carefully. I wanted to make sure he felt confident and secure. Angie seemed relaxed in a way that made me slightly self-conscious. She didn't appear nervous or overwhelmed. She moved through the experience with ease. At one point, one caught myself analyzing the situation instead of feeling it. I was hyper-aware of body language, tone, small reactions. It felt less like passion and more like observation. The fantasy had been larger in our heads than it was in reality. It wasn't explosive or cinematic. It was intimate, but grounded. After it ended, we lay in the dim light catching our breath. My husband looked satisfied, but also thoughtful. Angie smiled and said it had been fun. He kissed my forehead and whispered thank you. That moment felt heavier than anything else that night. It felt personal. Angie stayed in our guest room. The door closed quietly behind her, and suddenly it was just the 2 of us again. The house felt strangely quiet. The next morning was anticlimactic. Sunlight streamed in like it was any other Sunday. Angie had already left before we woke up. I asked him how he felt about it. He said he appreciated me for being open-minded. He said he felt closer to me. I believed him in that moment. There was no tension yet. No obvious cracks. Later that evening, I called Angie to check in. It felt polite, almost necessary. We ended up talking longer than expected. We laughed about how surreal the whole thing had been. The conversation felt easy. She suggested grabbing lunch later that week. I hesitated briefly before agreeing. It didn't feel inappropriate. It felt like continuing a conversation that had already started. Lunch turned into coffee the next week. Coffee turned into another meetup outside of book club. There was a strange bond forming between us. Shared experiences create intimacy, even if they're one-time events. There was something about having crossed that boundary together. It made conversations feel layered. When my husband found out we were spending more time together, something shifted in him. It wasn't immediate or explosive. It was subtle. He started asking how long I'd be out. He asked what we talked about. He asked if that night ever came up in conversation. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it was tight. I brushed it off at first. I reminded him this had been his idea. One evening he finally said it directly. He didn't want me hanging out with her anymore. The way he said it wasn't angry, just uncomfortable. I asked him why. He struggled to articulate it. He said it felt weird. I reminded him that we had all agreed to this. That I'd known her before this even happened. That nothing inappropriate was happening now. He said it wasn't about trust, it was about how it made him feel. That answer unsettled me. I started replaying that night in my head. I remembered the way he had looked at her. I remembered how observant she seemed. A thought crept into my mind slowly. Maybe this wasn't about jealousy at all. Maybe it was about perception. Maybe he was worried about being evaluated, about being compared, about being seen from two different perspectives at once. The fantasy had placed him in control in his imagination. Reality had introduced variables he couldn't manage. For the first time since his birthday, I felt a thin thread of doubt. Not about his loyalty. Not about Angie replacing me, but about ego. The fantasy had been easy to say yes to. The aftermath was starting to feel more complicated than the night itself. And I had a growing suspicion that the real consequences of that decision were only beginning to surface. The tension didn't explode overnight. It didn't turn into a screaming match or some dramatic confrontation. Instead, it settled into the house quietly, like dust you only notice once it's already everywhere. For a few days after he told me he didn't like me seeing Angie, we avoided the topic entirely. We talked about groceries and work and what to watch at night. It felt normal on the surface. But the normalcy felt rehearsed. Conversations had gaps in them that weren't there before. I could feel him thinking about something he wasn't saying. The first real crack showed up on a Thursday evening. I mentioned casually that Angie had suggested switching book club to a different cafe. He didn't respond right away. After a few seconds, he asked if we talked about that night again. His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharper than usual. It caught me off guard. I told him we hadn't, that we mostly talked about books and work and random things. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He asked if I thought it was strange that I wanted to keep seeing her. I asked him if he thought it was strange that we had invited her into our bed. That ended the conversation quickly. That night in bed, he was quieter than usual. I could feel him thinking. Eventually, he rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. I didn't think it would feel like that, he said. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated long enough that I thought he might take it back. Then he said the word I wasn't expecting. Exposed. That surprised me more than anything else he'd said. I asked him how he could feel exposed when he was the one who wanted it. He gave a small, humorless laugh. I thought I'd feel confident, he admitted. Instead, I felt like I was being watched. He explained that during the night, he became hyper-aware of everything. How he looked. How he sounded. Whether he seemed impressive. The fantasy in his head hadn't included insecurity. It hadn't included the possibility that someone else would be evaluating him silently. That awareness had unsettled him more than he expected. I realized then that this wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about me developing feelings for her. It was about him questioning himself. He said he didn't like the idea of Angie and I talking privately because it made him feel like he was being reviewed, like we were comparing notes. I tried to reassure him. I told him there was nothing to compare. That it hadn't been some life-altering experience. That's when he said something that shifted everything. He said he hadn't even enjoyed it as much as he thought he would. The confession hung between us. I hadn't expected that. He had seemed satisfied afterward. He admitted that there was too much happening, too many things to focus on at once. He felt like he was performing rather than participating. I thought I'd feel powerful, he said quietly. Instead I felt unsure. That word stuck with me. Unsure. It wasn't something he usually admitted. He told me he kept worrying that he wasn't doing enough. That maybe Angie was more experienced. That maybe I was noticing differences. The idea that he felt small in a situation he orchestrated was almost tragic. He had wanted validation. Instead he got vulnerability. He said he didn't want to do it again. Not because it was morally wrong, not because he regretted it, but because he didn't want to relive that feeling. Over the next few days, we talked more honestly than we had in a while. The fantasy had stripped something away, and in its place was insecurity we hadn't addressed before. He admitted that when Angie and I laughed together afterward, he felt like an outsider. That image surprised me. He had been the one receiving attention. He had been the center of the birthday surprise. Yet he felt excluded. It dawned on me that he hadn't wanted a threesome for connection. He had wanted it for proof. Proof that he was desirable. Proof that he could manage a fantasy. Proof that he could handle something bold. Reality doesn't always align with imagination. When a third person enters the room, so does perspective. Perspective can be threatening. I met Angie one last time for coffee. Not because he demanded it, but because I needed clarity for myself. She asked almost immediately if everything was okay. I told her there was tension. She nodded like she wasn't surprised. She admitted that she hadn't found the night particularly extraordinary either. It was fun, but not something she was eager to repeat. Hearing that relieved me more than I expected. It meant there was no lingering energy, no unfinished curiosity. When I told her I'd be keeping things to book club only, she understood. There was no drama, no wounded pride. It had been an experiment for her too, nothing more. When I came home, my husband looked tense. I told him it was handled. I saw relief spread across his face instantly. He apologized without me asking him to. He said he didn't realize how vulnerable it would make him feel. I admitted that I hadn't realized how complex the aftermath would be either. We had focused so much on the act itself. We hadn't considered the psychological consequences. That night, lying in bed, he said something that felt more important than the threesome ever had. He said he didn't need to prove anything anymore. I believed him. The strange thing was that the experience didn't break us. It exposed something that needed attention. We had mistaken novelty for depth. We thought adding someone would intensify our connection. Instead, it revealed our insecurities. We still see Angie occasionally at book club. It's polite and uneventful. The shared experience feels distant now. There's no tension left in the air. Just a quiet understanding that some fantasies are better left imagined. If you asked me whether I regret it, I'd say no. It forced honesty in a way nothing else had. But I also wouldn't romanticize it. The night itself wasn't the most intimate part. The conversations afterward were. The real closeness came from him admitting he felt small. From me choosing not to weaponize that admission, in the end, the threesome wasn't about sex at all. It was about ego. And ego is far more fragile than fantasy.